Welcome, everyone. So happy to see that so many of you are interested in this really important topic of digital accessibility and inclusion. My name is Hannah, and I'm hosting this webinar today on behalf of Nexer. And this webinar is part of Digital Day in Sweden, which is everything about embracing digital inclusion. So we're super happy to be part of this initiative, and it fits us very well because we work with these topics every day, and it's close to our heart at Nexer. Before I hand over to the experts of today, I just want to say that if you have any questions, we have activated the Q&A, so you can actually write your questions there, and then we will try to answer to them in the end of the presentation. Time is short, so if we don't have enough time, then we will try to get back to you. You will receive the recording afterwards, so we can try to answer in the email as well, or then you are also welcome to contact us anytime. You will get all of our contact details. So if you have any questions, any ideas, or if you need help with digital accessibility or inclusion, we are here for you. And I know that there are a lot of people today whose first language is not English. We are having this in English because we are a company that works in different countries, not only in Sweden, but also other parts of Europe and the world. And today our experts come from the UK. So we have activated the transcription, so you can use that. And then if you want to ask questions in Swedish or even in Finnish, you can do that in the Q&A, and I will translate them in the end. There's of course AI translation as well, but since we have limited time today, let's try to stick with these three languages: English, Swedish, and Finnish. But now I will hand it over to my dear colleagues and accessibility superstars, Danny and Molly.
Thank you, Hannah, and welcome everyone. I'd like to begin this session with a relatively simple question to think about. When you hear the word accessibility, do you think of complexity or of opportunity? And are those two things really that opposites to one another? Or can we strip away the complexity and focus on small, practical steps that open up it for everyone? I'm Danny Lancaster, and I'm joined by my brilliant colleague and friend, Molly Barnes. And together, we're going to explore what accessibility really means and leave you with at least one meaningful action that you can take, no matter what your role, your industry, or even your experience. And Molly, you and I talk about this subject a lot in public and also within our own practice and disciplines as well. But when you hear the word inclusion, what comes to mind for you?
How long have we got? Unfortunately, we don't have all day, but with inclusion, for me, from a personal perspective, I'm going to talk more about my story as we go along. But I think to begin with, let's start with our numbers and statistics. So globally, we have 1.4 billion people. So that's around 1 in 6 worldwide to have a long-term disability. When we're looking at Europe, so we've got a few numbers here across the board. It's around 1 in 5 Europeans have some form of disability. I should preface this by saying these are people that have been diagnosed with a disability. There are lots of people that can go years without a diagnosis for whatever reason. And the majority of people with disabilities actually have progressive conditions, or they come on over time rather than being born with a disability. So a lot of these conditions are still not diagnosed. And so arguably, when we think about inclusion, the numbers we're actually looking at are even bigger than these numbers that we have here. So we have a few acts and guidelines and so on out there. The most recent one and arguably most important one and relevant one, the European Accessibility Act, it came in this year, and it's across all products and services in private sector, and it goes beyond what you might have imagined previous. So we're looking at even things like what do we call it, those e-readers and e-commerce obviously really important for us today, but we have a few other things here on the list that cover. And one thing as well to mention, obviously, as Hannah mentioned, we're here in the UK and we're not a part of the EU, but we work with a lot of clients within the EU, so it's very, very important that all of us are on board with this act. So the importance of lived experience. So Danny asked me right at the beginning, you know, what does inclusion mean to you? Well, I'm going to talk a bit about that now. So my name is Molly and I was born deaf and was given my first pair of hearing aids at 18 months old. And with that and speech therapy and a really good support system at home, I grew in confidence. I had pretty good communication skills by the age of 5 or 6. Before then, I couldn't speak. So there was a lot of work that went in. And then, unbeknownst to everybody at this time, we then discovered I was struggling more from a visual perspective, which is really challenging for deaf people generally, because deaf people are so visual. And I was struggling with my eyes, and there were headaches. I was clumsy. I had started high school, secondary school, and I was really struggling to lip read. So my teacher of the deaf at the time said to me, Molly, you might need reading glasses. Not unusual to experience such visual exhaustion. Maybe glasses will help ease that. So I went for a routine eye check, thinking that I might just get some snazzy glasses just for reading and so on. However, the optician said that day to my parents, he asked, do you know why Molly is deaf? Which was a very peculiar question to be asking the opticians. And they responded, no, we were just told it was a technical blip. You know, we don't have any family history in deafness. It was what it is, you know. And the optician said, I think what's wrong with Molly's eyes is linked to her deafness, possibly Usher syndrome. So to cut a very long story short, lots of appointments later, I did in fact get diagnosed with Usher syndrome. Now, Usher syndrome, you may or may not have heard of, but it's the most common cause of congenital deaf blindness. So it is a condition that I was born with. Beginning with hearing aids and a severe hearing loss, and then during your adolescence years, so when I turned about 12, that's when I started experiencing visual loss. So with retinitis pigmentosa on its own, it's a very common progressive blindness as well, but you lose your peripheral vision. So the rate of progression and how much the person loses depends on the person. So we were quite optimistic in the beginning. We hoped that I wouldn't lose a lot of my sight until I was an older adult, because that's what they said back in 2006. They said, yeah, Molly shouldn't lose too much of her sight until she's in her late 20s, early 30s. However, I went from being partially sighted at the age of 12 to severely sight impaired, politically correct for blind at the age of 14. So I am now 31. So I have actually been registered blind over half of my life now. And I have about useful 5 degrees vision left in one eye. So arguably my life has been about inclusion and accessibility from the very beginning with hearing aids, because that was how I could access sound and communication. And then it was when I got to school and getting a job and university, how I would access the world around me was down to technology. And that's arguably why I work doing this job, because I'm very passionate about accessibility. One of the biggest barriers that I face, lots of people with disabilities face, generally speaking, are the misconceptions around disabilities in general. But for me, with my blindness and my deafness, if I had a penny for every time someone said to me, Molly, you don't look blind, your eyes look, you know, normal, quotation mark, I'd be a very rich lady. I would not need to work. However, blindness, it doesn't work like that. I think it's 93% of the blind community actually have some useful vision. So I actually wanted to show this in an illustration. And I did this years ago. Actually, we've used this illustration a lot, haven't we, Danny? So, but this is a picture of Bella, my guide dog. my retired guide dog. She's now retired and she looks very young and youthful here, which makes me feel. And then we have an overlay, which is the arty part where I got creative, trying to show how I see. So I mentioned that I've lost peripheral vision, but people have said to me, is it black? And I'll say, no, it's not black. A lot of it, so where I've drawn black here, a lot of it is if you put your hand behind your head, you just don't see it. It's like that here in the periphery. But there are grey patches, there's flashing lights, there's floaters. That's what we would call our non-useful vision. So when we say 93% of the blind community have some useful vision, my useful vision is here in the center, but there's still a lot of damage going on there. The light receptors are damaged, the flashing light, the floaters, all the zigzags and so on. Basically a disco ball in my eyes, which isn't as fun as it sounds. So Chris, he actually very cleverly took from this illustration and laid it as an overlay on top of a digital site. So this is the Apple website, I believe, and he's put it on the screen so you could see kind of roughly what it's like for me looking at a website. So I do have some useful vision and I do ironically use it a lot. I'm actually quite a visual person, and that's what confuses people, especially when I am using products and services. I will still lean on things like zoom and color, a lot of visual things, but I also use things like voiceover and speak screen. So there's a lot of things to be considering when we think about accessibility on the web. As I mentioned right at the beginning as well, the majority of the disabled community have acquired a disability, which looks very different to someone being born with a disability in terms of their experience. So I experienced both things, right? So I was born deaf, so I don't know what it's like to not be deaf. However, I acquired blindness. So I was born a very visual person, and so arguably I am still visual. But with my 5 degrees vision, if you were to compare me to a blind person that was born with 5 degrees vision, you can guarantee that me and this person probably will use our devices or go about our day very differently. Because as I say with my deafness, I was born deaf, I don't know any different, and I get on really well with my hearing aids. Mind technology has gotten better and better. It'd be different for a blind person being born with 5 degrees useful vision. They would be a whiz. They probably are better at using a screen reader than I am because they've done it their entire life, whereas I'm constantly learning. So it's really important to think about this when you're thinking about users and access needs. They don't all look the same, and everybody's experience does vary. So why is this important? Because anybody can have challenges. And obviously we talked about numbers right at the beginning, but I did also say there's lots of us that are aging. As we age, it's inevitable. A lot of us will need glasses by the age of 40. It's pretty likely we'll need glasses. A lot of like my parents, for instance, they're both in their 60s now. They wear glasses. They have their text size larger on their phone than I have mine. So this is a little fun picture that says you admit defeat and increase the font size on your phone. I wonder if any of you have got to that point or not, but thankfully these little handheld devices that we all have the ability to do so. You can enlarge the text so you can read your text, your emails and so on. However, when you jump onto a website or an app where they're supposed to understand that you've got large text enabled, it's not always compatible. And that to me is very strange when you think how many people actually would benefit from large text. So inclusive design benefits us all. So not just large text, as I just mentioned, but pinch zoom. I'd be amazed if any of you have never used pinch zoom, especially with our touch devices, whether it's your tablet or your phone. A lot of us, if you're jumping on and want to zoom in on a picture or you want to zoom in on a tick box, you might just pinch pinch zoom to tick a box. Dark mode became quite a trendy thing for a while with social media. You could just flip it to be dark mode. It's seen as a preference, but it's actually more of an accessibility tool. It increases that contrast. It also makes it a lot easier when you're outside and it's really sunny. You can then still read your text messages and so on. There's lots of keyboards that look slightly different that can make life a lot easier as well. And captions. There are so many statistics out there now to say that a lot of people, if not the majority of people, rely on captions to consume their content, because not everybody is listening to the audio for whatever reason. You might be on your commute to work, it might be really noisy, but then of course you've got the deaf community that have always benefited from them. But it's just important to know that it's not very small groups of people. There's lots of people that would benefit from inclusive design. So let's normalize it. So thinking about normalizing, we have again a few things nowadays that are such a thing as inclusive design that we don't notice. Things like volume, that's something that we adapt to our environment, whether it's we can't hear it or whether we're lowering it down because baby's having a nap. That is still an accessibility tool. But when we think about digital, how do we think about this, Danny? Let's talk about the digital landscape.
Yeah, well, excellently done, Molly, as always. But unfortunately, when we talk about the digital landscape for accessibility, it doesn't paint a great picture at all. And this isn't just our word for it. There is plenty of research available that highlights that people like Molly and the millions of us have barriers when it comes to accessing our digital services and our content. One such example of this comes from WebAIM, who are a non-profit organisation and a leading expertise in the field of accessibility. They provide many cool tools and resources, but one of their most interesting projects is their annual 1 million report. Now, this project identifies the top 1 million websites in the world, and based on many different demographics, such as location, language, industry, and it runs its own automated accessibility tool called Wave to get a snapshot of the digital landscape. Now, this tool is mapped to one of the largest frameworks for accessibility, which you may have heard of, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, otherwise known as WCAG. And from the most recent review from the top 1 million homepages, there were over 50 million distinct accessibility errors that were detected. Now, just think about that for a second. This is the top 1 million websites in the world, and still we're looking at around an average of 51 errors per page. So let's look a little bit deeper then. What are the most common issues in that sample in 2025? Well, 79% of them had low contrast text. 55% of them had missing alternative text for their images. 48% had missing form labels, 45% had empty links, 29% had empty buttons, and 15% of them had a missing document language. Now, what's wild about these 6 issues here is they account for 96% of all the issues found within that sample. And if that wasn't wild enough for you, these have been the same for the last 5 years since WebAIM started this research. So that is completely the entire purpose of this talk, is to make a commitment together that we can fix the 6. Because as stated in that report, addressing just those few types of issues would significantly improve accessibility across the web. And to help and to how much we believe that we need to make these issues and barriers removed from our services, we're going to spend a little bit of time to go into those 6 and outline what it means from a user point of view and show some real world examples of how we can address them. And the first one, the largest one that appears every year, is around low contrast text. And before we identify the requirements behind it, it's probably helpful to identify who benefits from making sure that those issues don't exist. So people with low vision, that print screen, that illustration on the Apple website, for example, the buttons, things like that, because of the impact from the blurring and the, as Molly described, the disco lights, means that that contrast really needs to be sufficient, allowing people with low vision to be able to see the content clearly. But another big group of individuals or community is around people who have colour blindness as well. And typically, going back to what Molly mentioned before around that idea around assuming if somebody said they were colourblind, for example, you might be forgiven to assume instantly that it's something like this image in the top right-hand corner here. So we've got on the screen a range of different cakes, rainbow cakes, with the top left one being sort of regular vision, what you would see if you didn't experience any of these types of colour blindness. And the one that people typically assume of is this grayscale next to in the top right. But as you can see, there is a huge range when it comes to these types of impairments. So, what might be problematic for one individual might be very different experience for another, particularly around things like the reds and the greens and such like that. So we need to make sure that first and foremost that contrast is sufficient to ensure that those things can be much more clearly identified. But bringing this into the digital examples then, we need to make sure the colour contrast is sufficient, but we also nearly need to ensure that colour isn't a reliance for any sort of information. So here we have these accordions, and when you open one of the accordions, it changes from a black font to a sort of an orangey red. And within there, we've also got a link to course schedule, but the only identification that this is a link is by a colour change on it. So we're relying on colour alone to convey that meaning. Now, if we were to put one of those simulations on top of this, we would see where those problems probably are more obvious. So the heading that was below colour contrast requirements, that's arguably much more difficult to identify in terms of the other content on the page. And that course schedule link, very, very challenging to identify as a link in this sort of situation. So providing something like a typical underline for the links and those sorts of things would make a huge difference to be able for people to be able to identify and be able to use that content effectively. So if we're talking about who's responsible for a better choice of words, then designers, this is obviously a huge part of something to check when it comes to making your designs and making sure they're accessible. The next one was around missing alternative text for images, and truth be told, because of the nuances with alternative text, this is one that comes up very, very often in our audits and our technical reviews. So alternative text is a text description for an image fundamentally. So it allows people who can't perceive that image to be able to get an understanding about it, what its purpose is. And when we use the word perceive, we're talking about people who maybe, as Molly's described, maybe visually impaired and might be relying on some sort of assisted technology to read the page back to them, in which case it can read the image if this is a text description. But it might also impact somebody who is in sort of using low broadband or maybe in a rural setting or something like that, and they have to disable their images to get better page load speed and things like that. So again, quite a range in the types of people who might benefit from the use of alternative text. But it needs to be the fundamental aspect behind alternative text is it needs to be contextual. It needs to be there to support what that image is purpose is. So here we've got our health profile, and they've gone a bit artsy in this example and decided to put all of the information in these sorts of gauges to allow you to identify if you're in a good or a bad or a medium ground in terms of your health risks. Now, because they're only using the images, though, if we couldn't receive that information, we wouldn't get that access to it. So we need to make sure the text description is sufficient for what is trying to outline as its purpose. But in this example here, all of the images here are missing that attribute. So most cases, the file name is the fallback for it, and that is never going to be as effective or as helpful in any way, shape or form. So if you couldn't, those users I mentioned before, they physically wouldn't get the information they need at this part for the health profile because it's completely contained within an image without a text description. But the other side to alternative text is around unnecessary alternative text as well. So in those examples before, the health risks, they're meaningful images. If we took those images away, we would lose that context on the page. A lot of images and media online is mainly being used from an eye candy sort of point of view. It's just there for visual purpose to help break up content and things like that. It doesn't provide much value in terms of actual context. So we need to consider if we could remove that image and replace it with 100, 1,000 different types of images, would we lose any meaning from it, from the page itself? So in this case here, we've got Simplifying the Media Industry. A banner is in place, and they've got this very nice artistic banner to describe, to provide a little bit more of that sort of eye candy to it. But if we actually look at what those alternative text is for it, so firstly, it's not just one flat image, it's actually many, many different images put together within the actual page itself, which is impressive in its own right. But when we come to looking at the alternative text for it, we see that every one of those images has geometric shape. Like there's no context there behind what that image is trying to really represent to a user. And it becomes unnecessary because of it. So particularly when you're working with content teams and things like that, and you're choosing images or marketing, really consider about what the alternative text, what you're trying to describe in that image. The next one was around misinformed labels, and arguably, especially with things like, as Molly mentioned, with the European Accessibility Act and such a focus on things like e-commerce, then making sure our form processes are accessible is absolutely essential for it. Again, when we're talking about sorts of users who might benefit from things like missing form input labels, it's, again, a lot of it comes down to people who can't perceive the form itself. So if they're using, as mentioned, assistive technology to read that information back to them, if they can't see what the form is on the page itself, then they still need that context and that information to be able to go and complete it. So here we've got a relatively basic form. We've got 4 text fields: your email address, your phone number, your support worker's email address, and their phone number. But if we were going to go through this with a screen reader, so an assistive technology that would read that content back to the user, we would actually hear unlabeled, 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 unlabeled. So without that context, without that information, and there's no chance for those users to be able to effectively complete that form. So again, although we've got those visual labels on the page, they're not associated to the inputs in any way. So if there are any developers, for example, on the call, very much looking at your forms, making sure that the labels are clearly associated to them, ensures that these types of users can go through the same process effectively. The next one is empty links. We've also put in suspicious in here, snuck that one in as well, because there's, again, a few considerations when it comes around to making some really clear link text. So everyone benefits in some way from link text. Everyone, when you see a link, you want to know where it's going to go to before you click on it. You want to make sure it's descriptive of that purpose. So one way we can do this is by actually looking at the links in isolation and seeing about if we can get some sort of context for them based on knowing what website we're on at any given time. So here we've done just that. Here's a list of all the links that are on a particular website. So the first one, available in over 250 stores. Yeah, that's probably fine given the context that you know what website you're on to begin with. Then we come into these sort of formatting challenges. So premium-beauty, smoking-control, feel-good-Friday. Again, looks a bit strange if nothing else, and it can be difficult to interpret because of that. Then we come into the sort of rather unhelpful query strings. Health-winter query equals long string of digits. Then we got the 768. Some more formatting issues, and then we sort of change tack entirely, and we just start almost shouting full capitals, these are the links, sort of thing. And often when we talk about accessibility, a big theme around it is around consistency. So as you can probably see from these links here, there is very little consistency behind those links that are actually being presented. It might make sense in certain aspects of the site, but when you're looking at these links in isolation, they need to be understood first and foremost in isolation, but they also need to make sure you're following some sort of recognized pattern for how you're trying to present the links, ideally without things like dashes and query strings and stuff like that. Next is empty and fairly generic as well, there buttons. E-commerce sites, big offenders for this. Everything is an add to basket and things like that. There are certain changes you can make from the code itself to make it more contextual for those users if you don't want to change the visual design too much. But the principle is there that we really need to make sure users have informed decisions about what they're going to be adding to their basket or purchasing at any given time, especially around things like e-commerce and stuff like that, as you can imagine. So when we look at the buttons, again in isolation on this page, we can see that the first one is clear basket. Fine, that's a sufficient button text. The next one is unlabeled, so that's missing that text completely. We don't know at this stage what that purpose is. And then we come into the long generic territory of about 40 or so items, all with the button text, add to basket. And could anyone, confidently say that they were knowing what they were going to be buying or putting in their basket at any given time under those conditions? And the answer would be probably not. And lastly, the one we have is missing document language. We don't have a fancy, example like the other ones, because honestly, this one is more comes down to, I don't like the word too much, but it more comes down to best practice for building websites more than anything else. I find this hard to believe it's necessarily just an accessibility consideration in that way. So I'm not a developer. I don't have a technical background, but about a year or so ago, I thought I'd try and look into a HTML course and learn a little bit of coding to try and support the accessibility work that we do. And I was shocked that this was lesson 2 in that. It's very, very early on in the actual course itself. And I just thought to myself, how does 15% or so of the top 1 million websites not have this? I completely understand the other 5, but this one is, as I said, it feels like a bit more best practice for building websites, but it allows screen readers fundamentally to understand the pronunciation of text in the language that they've set on their own devices. So very, very important. Amazing how often it's missed. So it's around this stage that I can normally hear people saying, well, what can we do? Almost screaming it out. Obviously very, very difficult on a remote call, but I think the premise is still there. We want to know, well, we know about the 6 issues, but what can we do to actively go about looking for them and resolving them ourselves? Well, as I mentioned, all those 6 were taken from one bit of research with using one free tool. So if there's one thing you can start doing, if you haven't already, is by start running Wave on your services. You can run it straight in the browser at wave.webaim.org, or you can use their Chrome extension and you can run that on a page-by-page basis. And I've got to say that report that you get, it's pretty powerful. Of course, it will tell you about the errors on the page. So these are direct violations of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and therefore they have to be fixed from a compliance aspect, if nothing else. And in there, we've got examples of things we've already discussed today relating to missing alternative text, missing form labels, and empty links. But it also shows you what they describe as alerts as well. Now, these aren't necessarily violations of the guidelines, but they would improve accessibility and usability in many cases. And again, we've got things relating to alternative text and suspicious link text as well. And if anyone's a little bit worried about the numbers, I particularly chose a really poor site to get these print screens from. I'm hoping yours don't have that level of them, but really it's essential that we take the time to go through and try and identify which issues we can resolve and where we need to bring in other teams and have those talks with. But likewise, it's amazing how many people really don't explore the other aspects of this report, such as the features, the structural elements, and the use of ARIA as well. Especially the feature section. So many people say, well, it's green, it's got a tick on it, and it says that we've got things like alternative text in place. So that's a good thing, right? Well, yes, but they then forget the first principle to accessibility in that it is a human first approach. Even these tools, they should be called semi-automated because we actually check one of those for alternative text and their values. We can see that one of them is edited-dt-hero-copy-data2 bracket 1 bracket, it's complete nonsense, right? So really taking the time to explore what is in place and what's been already used is really, really important for it. So with all that in mind then, if I may leave you with just one more thought about accessibility, it's to consider baking it into what you do. So tools like Wave, for example, they work most effectively in our live environments when the content, the third parties, and everything else isn't together, which is often too late. Instead, we need to be thinking about doing this much, much earlier in our processes. So traditionally, accessibility is considered at the end of the project, if not after go live. You know, it might come from feedback internally, it could come from a complaint, or it could come from something worse. But at this point, it's really seen as a large investment, because if something like a color contrast issue was found, issues would have to go right back through the timeline, making it very difficult to fix and very costly as well. So instead, if we started thinking about accessibility in terms of small investments and splitting out the responsibilities within our organizations and our life cycles, we would get far, far better results. This way, we could reduce costs, improve quality, and ultimately make accessibility a natural part of our projects. So in summary today, please, if you haven't already, please go and check your websites using Wave. Please also do, though, bring in the findings with your teams and wider, see what you can have control over about who you can bring in to support you on making the fixes necessary from anything you find. And then go one further than that and champion accessibility in everything you do. We need advocates in organisations, within communities, to really start shedding more and more awareness around accessibility and the requirements behind it. And lastly, please also remember that you can never rely on these tools on their own. While accessibility audits can help provide a snapshot of a service at any given time based on the guidelines, you can never truly say something is accessible without involving real users with real access needs. So in that, I would just want to thank you from myself and Molly, and to say that we wish you all of the best of luck on your own accessibility journeys.
Thank you, Danny and Molly. I've learned so much again. Fantastic presentation. I was actually looking at the Q&A, and there are no questions, so obviously everything is clear to everyone. But I have one question, because not everyone in this call is necessarily working directly with websites. We are, thankfully, we have a job where we can make a difference. But as a consumer or user as web pages and different digital services, what should I do? What could I do to drive accessibility? Do you have any tips, like if you're just regular visitor of websites?
I mean, you can, communicating and bringing the attention straight to them is also very, very valuable. People don't know what they don't know. So as I said, as a way of bringing up that information to them, you could be going through their contact forms and reaching out to people and maybe the networks around it to sort of highlight the needs for it. You are right, though, Hannah, a lot of this is based on websites, but the same principles apply to lots of different roles. So if you're, working in marketing, or maybe you're working and making internal documents and things like that, color contrast, alternative text, you don't know who are going to be receiving those documents. So even if it's those sorts of roles as well, it's really important that you still consider about what you can be responsible for. But that end user point of view as well, it's really important to engage as much as you can, and raising awareness is such a valuable tool within this industry, because it's not a focus area for a lot of organizations, when hopefully over the last 40 minutes or so we've shown that it is, and there's practical things we can do to help with that as well. Molly, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that.
I was echo everything Danny said, but I was also thinking from like a recruitment point of view as well. If you say in whatever team you are in and you are looking to expand, definitely look from within as well, because mostly when we think about inclusion, it's got to come from within. If you're recruiting inclusively, your services and products are going to be designed and developed inclusively as well. So I think it's really important, by just looking around you and sort of thinking, right, okay, what can we do to improve our workforce, and obviously deliver better products and services. And ultimately it would be a good start to start from within, and of course, like Danny said, obviously this website, with this slide deck, we were talking about the top 6 issues online, but when we think about inclusion, we're not just thinking about accessibility. Inclusion is a massive area, and there's lots of aspects to inclusion where we could all be always doing a little bit better, and I think it's always worth remembering that accessibility, inclusion is a journey. It's not something, a checkbox exercise. Obviously, fixing the 6 would make a huge difference, and hopefully, you know, you've learned something from today. But it is an ongoing commitment, and I think whatever role and whatever background you come from, we can all start trying to make a difference by just starting the conversation. But yeah, hopefully that's offered you enough insight for today anyway.
Yes, and I mean, also we should think about accessibility at workplace and the tools that we use at our workplaces, and not just external web and external tools. Thank you so much again, and just want to remind you, if you still want to ask questions, you're welcome to contact us, or if you need help with anything. And as a gift to everyone who was here today, we're actually able to offer a free quick review of your website if you want one. So please get in contact if that's of interest, if you need some help how to get started, and we're here for you. Thank you so much. Did someone have a question still? I saw someone raising a hand.
Yeah, so I've just spotted one in the chat.
Yeah.
Molly, do you have a favorite browser on mobile and desktop?
So I have always been an avid Apple user, because of the built-in accessibility features. So ordinarily on my phone, it's Safari, and that's what I've kind of adapted to. And it's got my built-in dynamic text and all of that. It works very well. Work, I use a lot of Chrome, and again, there's a lot of extensions and things that I can get that can improve the accessibility of sites. But I think a lot of the time, even with these extensions, they are treated as more like an overlay, and it doesn't always work, and it's not very compatible with a website. So really having a website built to be more accessible would work better alongside my tools. So yeah, hopefully that's answered your question anyway.
Now I see no more questions, and we are 2 minutes ahead of time. So yes, as you saw in the chat, maybe you will get the recording afterwards, and just don't hesitate to get in contact or add us in LinkedIn. Thank you so much, and have a fantastic weekend, everyone.